Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Bless you. Indeed. My name is Greg Hall. I'm the Dean of the Heron School of Art and Design. And again, really, I'm grateful. We're very grateful for you being here this evening and joining us and sharing your Saturday evening with us. I would like to take a moment just to acknowledge that tonight we gather on the ancestral lands of the Miami, Potawatomi, Lenape, and other Native peoples of the past and present. I also want to acknowledge that in the 1960s, IUPUI displaced the neighborhoods and business communities along Indiana Avenue. And we do hope that our campus continues to honor those who have cared for these spaces in the past. And we hope sincerely that its current use for the purest and for the pursuit and sharing of knowledge and understanding, which are goals of the university, will lead to a future that is more equitable and just. But again, thank you for being here tonight. And thank you so much for your contributions to the conversation this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Joseph Mella, our curator and gallery director, and will help get us started for this evening. But please take a moment, go ahead and get settled. We've got a few people coming in, so we'll give this just a moment. But thank you again for being here. Very grateful for your time.
Hi, good evening. It's a pleasure welcoming you to all what I know will be a wonderful evening. But that was a rough start. This event is part of the 2022 Spirit and Place Festival. Spirit and Place is supported by the Lilly Endowment, Inc., the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI, Ellen Whitehill Clues Charitable Foundation, Bolson Group, and the Indianapolis Foundation, a CICF affiliate. Before I continue, I want to encourage each of you to complete an evaluation of this event. The Spirit and Place volunteers will be on hand to pass out and collect paper copies, and guests can also go to spiritandplace.org to complete an online evaluation. I want to mention just something more down to earth here a little bit, is that for those who parked in either of the garages across the way, when you exit, don't put your card back in that you were given. You'll put the card in and then that'll tell you how much you owe. And then instead of continuing putting money in, you put the code in. There's slips of these papers that have the code. They'll be out on the tables out front when you leave. This evening's event is being held in conjunction also with Past is Present, Black Artists Respond to the Complicated Histories of Slavery. Close to 6 years in the making, that began conceptually while I was directing the galleries at Vanderbilt University. Past is Present, and its programs were further shaped over the course of the last 2 years through the brilliant framework that our guest curator, Jonathan Michael Square, brought to bear on the project. Central to the premise of the exhibition was to tell Indiana-centric stories informed by contemporary Black artists living and working primarily in Indianapolis, as well as extending the reach of the show to encompass national, and in the case of Mary Sabande, international artists that each in their unique ways responded to the legacy of slavery. Additionally, by working with my colleagues at the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites, the Indiana Historical Society, the Indiana Archives and Records Administration, as well as the American Antiquarian Society and Fisk University, we were able to display several rare historical objects in the exhibition to help contextualize the contemporary work while revealing stories of resilience, many with ties to Indiana in the face of extreme oppression and often physical violence. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to thank our panelists joining us this evening, each of whose work is featured in Past and Present, LaShonda Crow Storm and Shamira Wilson. Thank you both. A project of this magnitude requires extensive support from many quarters. This evening's event and the exhibition that is an extension of it is made possible by a generous grant from the Ellen Whitehill Clues Charitable Foundation and the Indianapolis Foundation, a CICF affiliate. I offer my sincere thanks to each of those foundations for their support. I also want to give my enthusiastic thanks to our hospitality sponsor, Hotel Indy. All of our visiting artists and scholars have a premier place to call home while in residence at Heron. Thank you. Additionally, I want to thank the Great Frame Up with 4 locations in and around Indianapolis for providing guests to the galleries, including you this evening, with free parking. Thank you to the Great Frame Up. I'd like to recognize and thank our lead campus partner for the project, the Center for Africana and Cultural Studies at IUPUI, as well as the IUPUI Multicultural Center and the IUPUI Senior Academy. I think representatives from all 3 of these groups and entities on campus are here this evening. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator and guest curator, Jonathan Michael Square, who will in turn introduce our 2 panelists, excuse me. Jonathan Michael Square is an assistant professor of Black visual culture at Parsons School of Design. Last academic year, he was a fellow at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, the Fashion Institute of Technology, and most recently at Harvard University. His writing has appeared in Fashionista, Fashion Studies Journal, Refinery 29, Small Axe, Hyperallergic, British Art Studies, and the International Journal of Fashion Studies. A proponent in the power of social media as a platform for radical pedagogy, he founded and runs the Digital Humanities Project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, which explores the intersection between the histories of enslavement and the fashion system. He is currently working on a book manuscript of the same topic, tentatively titled Negro Cloth, How Slavery Birthed the American Fashion Industry. Please join me in welcoming my good friend, Jonathan Square. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I want to start off by thanking Herron Galleries and the Herron School of Art and Design for welcoming me into your scholarly community. I want to thank Joseph and also want to thank April and Peyton, the gallery managers. Past is Present, Black Artists Respond to the Complicated Histories of Slavery explores creative responses to African-American history and legacies of slavery. Today, we have the opportunity to sit down with 3 artists, actually 2, LaShonda Crow Storm and Shamira Wilson, 2 Indianapolis-based artists who reflect on slavery's past and present in their own unique ways. Today, we have the privilege of learning about their inspiration, creative practices, and contributions to Past is Present. I wanted to talk a little bit about my curatorial practice and why I chose Shamira and LaShonda's work. Oh, sorry. And I was just talking to LaShonda a few minutes ago in the gallery, and one of the reasons much of LaShonda's work fits within the theme of Past is Present, but the reason we were really gravitated towards red lines is the scale. I was really attracted to the amount of space that it takes up, and I think it's a powerful political message that it's so long and that a community of makers were involved in making red lines. And LaShonda's going to talk more about that in our conversation. This is one of the murals created by the phenomenal Shamira Wilson. And, you know, what I really appreciate about this mural is that it's both very emblematic of your work, but also a departure from your work. Your work is very bold, very geometric, very linear. And in this work, you sort of stepped outside of yourself. And I really appreciate the sort of painterly flourishes that you contribute to this work. So I look forward to hearing more about your creative inspiration. Actually, I was present when you were creating this work, so I'm really excited to hear more about it. This is another shot. Shamira's contribution to Past is Present. So feel free to join me on stage. And we're going to talk more about your works and your contributions to the show. Well, first off, I want to ask you about your contributions to Past is Present. And I guess we can start with you, LaShonda, talking about red lines and talking about, and actually, Shamira, you're involved in the making of red lines. So you have something.
What are we doing?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So Red Lines has a complicated history. It was not, it was a project I was asked to do after a public pushback. At the time, the Indianapolis Museum of Art was doing work with artist Shaitu Jones about, he does these huge food projects, and they wanted to talk about food insecurity in Indiana. So in my other hat, I'm actually an urban farmer as well. So chickens, all those things, that's my life too. And the discussion began with Indiana, in case you don't know, is always in the top 1 to 3 of food insecure cities in the country. And how is it that you can be a city with less than 1 million people and beat out New York and be a breadbasket state and you still cannot feed your population? And my response was like, well, okay, that's interesting, but that's not good enough. As a person who does community development work, everyone in town works on food issues, and we still haven't been able to resolve them. I was like, but you as the Indianapolis Museum of Art, you actually sit on the historical Mason-Dixon line of Indiana, of Indianapolis. 38th Street is the red line where Black folks couldn't live above it. And how can we talk about this, why people cannot eat, if we cannot talk about what are the historical reasons why some neighborhoods actually don't get resources? And so there are reasons why you have 10 square miles with 1 grocery store. There are reasons why when you hit 38th Street, you can walk 2 blocks north, hit $500,000 homes, walk 2 blocks south, people can't even put food on their table and their schools are going under. And we have to talk about the history of why it looks like that and what is the current reality of that. We can't just start with, oh, let's talk about food. And there was a really strong public pushback in a community setting when they brought the project forward. And I will be honest, I led the pushback because I was like, we got to do better than this. Later, the museum reached out and was like, well, what does it mean? And I was like, we need to first talk to Shaitu, and then we can figure out what it means. And what that meant was the creation of red lines. And then I was like, well, hold on. We need to actually figure out what that means, because that is 426 feet of quilting that would have to be created from scratch and made within the span of 6 months. So as a community-based practitioner, that meant I had to go to my team of basically elderly ladies and be like, can we do this? And they were like, well, we'll think about it. We'll talk to you in a couple of days. And they came back and they were like, well, let's try. So things go along. We get to the making, 426 feet and 3 inches. They said, I better mention that 3 inches every time because we worked hard for that 3 inches. We ran into issues that elders have, which were some medical issues, but we still have this deadline and they're still determined to get it done. Thus, that's when I go get Shamira and like, oh, I need you to come over here and start stitching. Then sewing machines go down. You go from a sewing machine that goes at the rate of 2,000 stitches a minute to one that goes to like 700 or one that goes to 200, but deadlines don't stop. And so one way to think about it is each one of those panels takes about 10 hours to stitch, 10 to 12 hours to stitch to quilting alone. And that's before we get to the actual piecing it together. That's before the custom made fabric that we had to have shipped in. So it's a lot of labor. And I'm proud of my community that we were able to circle up and create a space where we could talk about not just food insecurity, not just the history, but the ways in which these processes where we keep people out, that we keep people from lack of access to resources, how they continue to morph and manifest. And here's a trick for you. What is the new way that we redline people? Someone shouted out. It's your zip code. So every day that you type in your zip code, that determines what access you have to even if a pizza will be delivered to you. Determines your rate of insurance. It determines whether or not you can get certain types of loans. So it hasn't changed, and it's really important that we see how these histories switch and manifest and they look different. How do we participate? So this becomes at the root of how we get to red lines. Thank you.
I came to be involved with Red Lines as LaShonda's intern for about 2 years, I think, with Spirit in Place. Seems longer. Yes, as your friend. Absolutely. And we've kept in touch. And whenever she has a project and I'm available, I join. And so with this one, what struck me with this project was my personal connection with fabric. And I've grown up on Clifton, which is not far from the IMA, far from the site where we held that dinner. My parents still live over there. My grandmother and my mother are all stitchers. They quilt and needlework. And my contribution to that is painting. I look at the patterns and the design, and they do the actual stitching. I find that that's just where my comfort is and where my specialty is. And I'm moving into food and gardening from the information that they've passed on to me. So all of the things with this project were definitely a part of my practice as well that I was able to contribute.
Can I ask a question about that? Because when I see your work, and actually Joseph reminded me of this earlier, you're actually inspired a lot by textiles. And can you talk a little bit? You talked a little bit about quilting and how your family were stitchers and worked with textiles, but can you talk about some of your textile inspirations when you're creating work?
Sure. Growing up, my mother used to make a lot of my clothing. And I actually still have the very first quilt she made me. I was probably about 3 or 4 years old. And she would save pieces of the clothing that she would make, and she stitched it together and made a quilt for me. And right now it's my my couch quilt that I lay under. And I plan to redo that and over dye it with indigo and patch it up with things that are relevant to my clothing history right now. So I grew up around women always using their hands and making, and grandparents who were outside gardening. We grew all of our own food for the most part, as much as we could, and would go to the U-Pick farm summertime and get our food and preserve. So I'm learning ways to continue some of those traditions and find ways that they have meaning for me now. I also worked in textiles right after college. After moving back from Baltimore, I worked at Meyer Fabrics for about 2 years, I want to say, in project management. And so I got to understand the logistics of working for a fabric manufacturer, mostly commercial. So I was able to see that side of things and continue my learning and just bring it forward again, continue bringing it into my practice. That was the last job that I had before I decided to become a full-time artist. And I still work with textiles.
I don't think of you as being a textile artist. I think of you more as a painter, and particularly large-scale public work. So can you talk more about your textile work, some of your professional work with textiles?
Sure. Some of my professional work with textiles, I like to look at the symbols of quilt patterns, how they tell stories. Specifically, there was a period of time when I was looking at African textiles and how you can use certain patterns to communicate a story through generations. So I think there was one in particular where they were looking at fertility, for example, and how to tell the story of women's fertility and communicate that through using certain imagery in this textile. And you can wear this clothing and share it with younger women and have them feel pride in being women, but also going through their menstrual periods. And how do you share that story from generation to generation while empowering people, doing it in a culturally specific way too. So as I'm working with my art practice, which is painting, I'm looking at food and the structures of plants and the language that it communicates to me. And I then translate those images into patterns that I use in my murals and large-scale public artworks.
I would love to see you do work with cotton. It's a plant, but it's also used to make a textile. There's a way you can sort of play around with the cultivation of cotton, the plant, but it's also used for textiles.
I've played with it a little bit. I've done some rust printing on fabric, and I started using cotton quilting fabric, which I found retained the dye a lot. So it's tiptoeing in there. Maybe there's something more there to explore.
Some pit cotton on them. If you want to understand the material, you have to go touch it. And I've seen your cotton things and I love them. So next time I go down south and we go to the plantation, you're welcome to come, because it's a different type of feeling when you actually see what it looks like from scratch. So I have big bushels of unprocessed cotton with the seeds, and it functions different than the little cotton balls you buy in the store, or even when you've gotten it and they've removed the seeds. It's just different. Always welcome to rock and roll with me. You know that, we can see what happens. We actually tried on one of my little farm projects to grow some up here, but it's just not the right climate.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I had a question about the length of red lines. It's specifically
3 inches. So, well, we needed to cover, I don't know if we can ever get to the video, but you could actually see the drone footage of the meal, but we needed to cover 40 tables. And once we got to sewing, we just didn't stop. We just kept sewing and sewing and sewing. And when we had reached what we needed, we had extra, and it would just be disrespectful not to include it all, just because we had reached what was needed. Because at the end, we just got everyone that I knew could sew and stitch, and we just kept making and making and making. And then when we looked up, we had too much. And so we were able to go over to the to 100 acres, because that was the only place really we could, when it was all done, stretch it out. And you can go to my website and see the comedy that ensued as we tried to figure out how to fold it, because it's a lot to fold. And it used to take about 45 minutes until after about 6 times, we figured out a faster way to do it. And but we were able to really stretch it all the way out. So that puts it as larger than a football field, pretty much. But that was the only place in town we could go and just have unobstructed space. And so we were able to stretch it out and measure it. So I like to honor all the work that people put into that. So we never cut it down. We kept even the 3 inches. We kept it. We kept all of it.
And how was the actual event? Because it was made for an event, a meal that was on, was it on?
It was actually not on 38th Street. It was on the street right after 39th, right there at 39th and Meridian. What was very interesting is that is also when the Red Line bus system was being put in. And we were like, who thought that they're naming this bus line through here, Red Line, which is actually where the historical Red Line was a good idea. And that the coming of the bus system then has led to rapid gentrification, which when you understand the processes of gentrification, it's not the end part, it is a process where first massive disinvestment happens, so then property values drop. So then people can come in and scoop it up. And so here we are. And this is the new bus system called the Red Line. And the history of redlining is why we are seeing what's happening in this neighborhood now, that people are, when that started, houses were valuated at about 35,000. Now they're being valuated at $500,000, and new houses are being built at 350,000. And so this is a neighborhood my family's been living in for 70 years because they were not allowed to live other places, and then many chose to return. So it was just the street right behind. They wouldn't let us shut down that street, which I advocated for because the bus line had just opened. So they were not gonna allow the shutting down of the street. But it did allow for really intense conversations. The goal was that city officials were there, neighbors from across both of those communities were there. I worked with them to community organize to make sure that voices that aren't typically invited to spaces there were brought there. And we're a part of that work as well. Working with them to connect to local small farms like Lawrence Community Gardens, working with youth conservation groups like Groundwork Indy to ensure that their youth were the ones that were working with the food, as well as door knocking and canvassing the neighborhoods to make sure that people got out to the space. So I can pull it up if you want. You just let me know.
Okay. Maybe later. You know what I would love for you to do though? To place red lines in conversation with your larger work. Because the first work that I saw by you was from the lynching series. So can you talk a little bit about that lynching series and other work that you've done?
So I am actually technically trained as a bronze sculptor, but I also view my work through themes. So whatever you're talking about, whether it's drawing, painting, ceramics, how you talk about that work changes with the materials, because how you would talk about something in metal is different, because metal has a different history, and how communities relate to metal is different. Metal is about honoring and uplifting. That's why so few things are in bronze. It takes a whole different level of skill and cost. People view textiles very differently. Everyone has them. They're in your homes. So at this point, we are 20 plus years into it. I run a project about the history of racial violence called the Lynch Quilt Project that looks at the history of lynching in the United States. And so if we backtrack, that's actually 1998 when I actually saw the image of Laura Nelson, which is a woman and her 12-year-old child that were lynched together in Okemah, Oklahoma in 1911. And I didn't know what to do with the image. I was like, I need to do something, but I don't know. And so it took all the way to 2002 to figure out it needed to be a quilt. But I am not a quilter. I am not trained in fabric at that time. Now I can tell you everything. But at that time I wasn't. So you do what you're supposed to do. You go find community and you say, can you teach me? And at that time I connected with the Needles and Thread Quilting Group when I was in Chicago. And thus we began that journey of how do we use textiles to talk about the history of lynching? How do we create space for community to come together and make together? So this is why we can get to red lines, because I've spent 20 years building an army of community co-conspirators to talk about this history. So it's not like these people just dropped out of the woodwork. We have spent 20 years working together around this history. We began with 10 people when I was still living in Chicago. Now hundreds work on it in communities across the United States. We are at the end. So after 20 years, we are at the end with the very last quilt, which will be completed first part of probably February, March. It has to go off to the quilters. So we have to wait till the Christmas quilting is done, because everything is done on a schedule. So right now, anything being quilted is Christmas presents. So, and so they explore lynching from the stats. So like right now, there's a 15-foot one that's down at the National Quilting Museum that literally has 1-inch blocks. There's one piece of fabric from every person that we actually have on the lynching rolls that we can count. And so you're able to go through and mark where women have died year by year. You can see, as now this year, it's 100 people. Next year, we're talking about thousands have died. And you're able to mark that time. So each quilt is different. It explores the theme of lynching from a different viewpoint. Community is always invited in. It also becomes a way that I learn, because I'm not a stitcher by training. That's not how I enter. I enter it because quilting makes sense. Quilting is an art form that's typically associated with women. Quilting made sense at the time because it allowed me to find a way to bring community together to circle up around the needle. And that's how I thought about it. And I didn't know what that really meant. That's just how I thought about it. And then I went to this quilting group and they kind of looked at me funny. So Needles and Thread is a primarily African-American quilting guild on the South Side of Chicago that has about 250 members. And so at the end of my presentation, as usual, when you talk about lynching, it's crickets, which I get it. And 10 people agreed to meet again. And thus we get to here. So when we get to red lines, it's not that difficult for me to call and be like, hey, community, guess what? Do you think you want to do this? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what it could mean and what it will do. And that's the only reason why it's possible, is because community has been built for 20 years at this point, of which Shamira becomes a part of my, my stitching community and my food community over time. And we just keep gathering people. Every time it's time to make, we create space. If it's a new city, we make space. We always make space for people to come to the table, to circle up, talk about different histories, talk about how do we transform this history from the now to what a possible future can be, and how do we get there?
Great. I want to go back to something that you said earlier about co-conspirators and the political power of quilting. Mm-hmm. We're going to go back to that, but I want to have a question for you, Shamira. Also, when I think about you, in this section, you're similar to the. Sure, yeah. Food, yeah. Like you think about food and nature a lot. It's one of your inspirations. You use growing in your work with plants as a form of creative practice. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because it's directly related to your contribution to Past is Present, because it's a botanical, it's a plant.
Yes, I think about food all the time. Food is community for me. I feel like food was also an initiation to adult things growing up, out with my family in the kitchen, picking greens, getting dinner ready, as much as I could contribute at whatever age I was, listening to the conversations. And also the lessons that I learned now that I have my own space to garden. I container garden, and I'm a farming apprentice here in the city. The lessons that I learned through gardening are immense and so valuable. So I feel as though it's important for me to share those lessons that I'm picking up, and continue to share those with the next generation of people who are growing after me or with me, because I feel like that's what we're here for. We're here to express, and we're here to share and build community. So building community around food is hugely important.
Besides vanilla, what's your favorite plant?
Okra, of course.
Okra.
For sure, okra.
Are there any plants that are inspiring any new work by you?
I'm gonna be with okra for a while. It is one of my favorite foods, one of my favorite vegetables. And it's still planted on my porch. I have a couple of plants that are still growing, and I'm just letting them go to seed. I enjoy watching the blooms, which are only open for about a day, and figuring out all the possibilities, whether it's using the flower as a dye or what are the possibilities. Thinking about how to use all of the parts of the plant, not just the fruit pod, what else can I do with it? What can it contribute to my life, and how can I contribute to its life as well? So I've just been watching it grow and letting it do its thing. And hopefully there will be an okra festival soon next year. We've been talking about doing that for a little while. And I've got a couple of friends who are equally as excited about okra. And it just started as an impromptu conversation in a garden, sharing seeds. The festival. So it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So I think that's a good sign from the universe, from ancestors, to keep going with it and to just let it unfold, and to bring other people into the mix that are equally as excited about it. And I think it gets a bad reputation because of its texture, which is actually where the medicine is. It's good for you for various reasons. That mucilage, I'm not going to say it right today. The mucusy texture can help eliminate a lot of toxins in your body. So that is a very beneficial aspect of okra, even though it can be a reason for people to avoid it. I think it's a reason for us to enjoy it as well.
You're preaching to the choir. I love okra. And there's something you said that really stuck out to me, using every part of the plant. Flower, the leaves, the actual fruit pod, of course, which is what you think of when you think of okra. But also thinking about the history of okra, it's a very diasporic. Is it a fruit or a vegetable?
I say botanical fruit.
Botanical fruit? Yeah. It's a very diasporic botanical fruit. It comes from Africa, and it's a key ingredient for a lot of dishes. I'm from Louisiana, so I grew up eating gumbo and succotash, but not just Louisiana cuisine, just Black cuisine diasporically. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about the history of okra?
Absolutely. So okra, from what research I'm starting to do and have understood, is that it's one of the seeds that we brought over with us during the transatlantic slave trade. And LaShonda, you may know a bit about hair seeds. Was it one of the that's what I thought. Yeah, one of the seeds that we braided into our hair to bring over. So there is that deep connection with African heritage, with the diasporic heritage. And in my practice, so I work a lot with food, and I'm starting to understand more about nutrition and specifically like ethnobotany. Why am I drawn to Africa, or not Africa, with okra specifically? Because maybe there is something there with my genetic makeup that makes okra more beneficial for me versus something else. So we can think about that with the United States and buffalo. Buffalo was eradicated from the United States, and now natives had to eat beef, and that caused a lot of diabetes and other problems, other health problems. So when we have access to foods that are more in line with our heritage, I think that we can reap some of those health benefits as well.
I can't wait to see the okra mural that you create. It's going to be beautiful.
Yes.
Make that happen.
Yeah.
But LaShonda, I want to go back to something that you said that was really powerful about creating community through quilting, and you refer to your partners, your community, the quilters that you work with as your co-conspirators. There's a lot of political power in quilting that goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries. People use quilting as a form of conveying political messages. So I wonder if you could, if that inspires your work a little bit, thinking about Gee's Bend and other communities of quilters throughout the American South and in the U.S.
A little bit more convoluted, but I want to go to this okra thing real quick. As you know, folk medicine is about drying okra seeds. And then when you eat them, they are actually the direct connection to the ancestors. That is a way to trigger ancestral memory. So go on and go dry you some seeds and tell me what happened later. But it is a way to dry the seed pods and then create access to the ancestors. So because I don't come through that art form for that way, it was always about how does it help tell the story of this woman and her child. Now, it grew to this, all these other quilts got birthed, but it literally was about Laura Nelson and her Soren Lawrence and her 2-year-old and her 2-month-old that were all lynched together. That is really where we begin. And it begins with how do we create space for women and whoever to circle up in an art form that has been associated with the Americas with women, and how do we create space for community? So all the rest of that becomes okay, but its root is how do we create space for community to have really hard conversations, and through those processes, create spaces for healing for folks. And the rest of it's okay, but that's like, if we look at the top 10, that's like 5, 6. It really is, how do we create that space to talk about hard histories? How do we create space so that if people need to come and cry? Because we have a lot of people who come and cry because these are lived histories. They are in the past. People's families, people have these memories and they were told not to talk about them. And so these become the spaces where they get to talk about it. And sometimes that means they cry about it. So the quilts are oftentimes just embedded with tears that people are able to come across generations and talk about how incidents happened in their family, and this is how their family was derailed, and that they may only be 20 years old, but they still live the ripple effect of that event. That for me, it was always about community first. The rest of it, yes, it grows from it, but if it can't center community and center spaces for healing, then we've kind of, for me, missed the ball. And so that does mean that you slow down because it takes longer. If you're flying to this city, that city, driving over here, doing that over there, it just takes longer. And it's not a space where people have to be expert quilters, where in the quilt world, they call them the quilt police, because they will come with their ruler and measure stitch per inch. They will do that. And I've had to be the buffer between community and the quilt police who want perfection. And I'm like, I just need to know if it's going to hold together, because the quirks and the quabbles are where the beauty lie, because that's where the people's stories lie, that people will come to learn how to sew because they need to tell their own stories in this. So for a long time, until we got to the last quilt, we actually collected fabric from around the country anytime a quilt went up, and it just became immense, like 27 garbage bags of fabric. And we would use as much as we could every time, and sometimes use it for other projects. But that was the commitment, that if you bring it, and people would literally show up and take the shirt off their back, or send in pieces of their family quilts, or they would make fabric. Textile artists would make fabric and send it in. So the internet didn't exist like it does now. So there was, in the beginning, a huge literal letter writing campaign, mailing letters all over the US to social justice groups, community groups, women groups, quilting groups, if you could find them, with just one simple question: will you contribute to this project? This is what we're doing. And it shows up, and you're honor bound to use it. So it was just after January 6th when we started to piece together the quilt about Laura Nelson's children, and we were able to use all of the fabric, the remaining fabric, because that was the last quilt where that fabric could be used like that before we got to the last quilt. So, and all those stories are there, and that is the community story. I just get to be this big conductor of co-conspirators who go out and find ways for us to go into the youth detention center and talk about lynching and how do you change the world, and the kids get it. The kids who've had the most hiccups in their lives, because that's what we call them. What you gonna do when the hiccup's over? And that's our discussion. And those are the ones who really get it about how to transform what happens next. And we create space for youth, because anything that comes next, they have to carry it forward. My job is to just be the bridge between the past and the present, so they can create a different future. Hope that answers your question. I feel like that's the truth of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And hearing you talk made me think about another work that's in the show by Samuel Levi Jones, because he also used his creative practice to work through a very traumatic incident. It's called Poplar Trees. It's in the big gallery. And he was not inspired, he referenced a lynching that happened in 1930 in Merriam, Indiana. He's actually related to one of the victims of that lynching. And he also, his sewing is also part of his practice. People think about the materiality of his work and the fact that he's an abstract artist, but he took book covers and actually sewed them together and stretched them across the canvas. And so that's actually, hearing you talk made me think about that work by Samuel Levi Jones, who's also interested in like the history of racial violence, but using his creative practice to sort of bring a light to, but also work through that trauma. I often say that text and textiles have the same etymology. So the same way you analyze a text, you do a close reading of a text, you can do the same thing with textile. Looking at the threads, looking at the way it's worn. There's a lot of like very important information embedded in the things that we wear and the things we make using textiles. Also thinking about like the African American tradition of quilting and the way of sourced different textiles from different things to make quilts.
I can say a quirky story, and it doesn't really fall as, because when I run into people in community, they oftentimes have this romanticized, and how my great grandmother was just like, girl, we was making cover, because they're from Appalachia. She was like, we was making cover. And, you know, I'm bringing her this quilt. Oh, look, look, look. And she's like, well, going out to that garage, and here is this big green metal. I remember it today. It's like a lime green. And I'm like, where did they get this from? Because this is like the 30s. But here were all these quilt tops that had just been sitting in the garage for like literally 70 years when they moved from Appalachia. And she was just like, you know, for you, this is a fun thing. She was like, but this was survival. She was like, you don't get it. She was just like, if it's cold, you've got to shear the sheep, and then you've got to process that. Then you've got to knit it. Then you've got to weave it. Then you've got to make all your clothing. Then you've got to make everybody's coats. Then you've got to make everybody's blankets. That it was never ending, the amount of textile labor that was required. And she was like, yeah, then, you know, World War II came. And this is literally how she says it. She's like, World War II came and everyone went to the factories. And she was like, and after World War II, you could literally buy a blanket. She was like, because before then, even the rich folks just paid other people to make all that stuff for them. And she was like, after World War II, you could buy a blanket. And she was like, and I never stitched again. And so you go out here, and here are all these quilt tops that my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandmother, who was one of 9 daughters, had hand-stitched, hand-pieced these things, and they had just been sitting in the garage. And then this is because this is my grandmother. I bring them in, I'm like, oh, what do we do? She was like, girl, you can have those. She was like, but bring that one over here. This is how I was going to finish it. So then she proceeds to tell me how to finish every single one of them. So this one, I was going to use this color, and I was going to have this border, and then I was going to do this border, and this is how I was going to stitch it in. I was like, so I feel like you want to do that. She was like, no, 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 you going to do that. And that was the end of it. So that becomes like the next project, because some of them are kind of fragile, because at this point, they are 100+ years old. Just because it was made of scrap. So back then that meant flour sacks and all kinds of things. But I just can't wait to see what happens with that. But she was just like, girl, we were making cover. That was survival. Now you go finish that. And so I think it becomes this, it's a different lived experience when it's your everyday having to do it, not just because I want to sit around with my quilting group, because they did do that and make pies and do all that other stuff. But it was so we wouldn't be freezing in winter. And so we wouldn't be naked running around, that, you know, it's cold in Appalachia. So we needed a hat. Not pretty, but it's true.
So is that your next project after you finish the lynching series?
It is. It will be what I work on. I've been working, the Great Lakes Quilt Museum, which is up at the University of Michigan State University, has a massive collection. You can look online, but I was able to take them to get looked at about how to preserve them. And you know, they're archivists. They have a different worldview than I do as an artist. They didn't want me to do anything to them. They were like, no, you just leave it as is. And I'm like, yeah, Granny's not going to be visiting, talking about, nah, I told you that one was supposed to have green and this one was supposed to have blue. So they will be completed. Yeah, they will be completed. So I'm excited about that part.
Excited too. I can't wait to see. I want to hear you two talk about place. Because when I think about your practice, LaShonda, I do think a lot about place. But for you, Shamira, your work is a little more abstract. So you do care about place, and you do have long roots in Indianapolis. So I would love to hear you talk about the role Indiana, Indianapolis, the Midwest might play in your work or might not actually play in your work, because I can see your work anywhere, actually.
Place play into my work. I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and I moved here in about first grade and would go back to Kentucky every summer, stay with my grandparents, then I'd come home to Indiana, start school again. So I did that process for about, till I was 13, till I was able to leave, but I was working and doing things. So that connection to going back to visit my family, continuing to learn from my grandparents. I was pretty much with them all day, visiting their church friends, cooking, going grocery shopping, doing the things that grandparents do, watching the black and white TV, watching their soap operas, Wheel of Fortune. Then they go to bed and I stay up and watch whatever I want to watch. So connection to place is connection to family for me, and connection to stories and traditions, but traditions in a way that is useful to my life, useful to my self-care, useful to me to pass on. I don't have children yet, so useful to me to pass on to friends, other family, whoever is willing to listen. Sometimes it's Instagram. And I'll share that way because that's where maybe I can reach someone. Maybe it's a family member who's on Instagram. And I think of Instagram as a quilt with the grid. So Instagram is my quilt sometimes, and that's the way that I can share and pass on those traditions I learned from my Midwestern upbringing. Place is also relevant in that a lot of the foods that I'm growing are typical in warmer Southern climates like okra. So I'm growing okra here in Indiana, but it's definitely not something you traditionally would see grown in Indiana. But I'm going to give it a try and continue telling that story of why it's such an important plant. Also vanilla. Vanilla is traditionally a more warmer climate plant as well. So it is pollinated in Mexico, but we use vanilla everywhere. But because it's pollinated in Mexico, that's why it's so expensive, because we have to hand pollinate it everywhere else. So place comes into play with the food that we're eating. Often the foods that we see in our grocery stores have to be transported from somewhere far away, unless you're getting them locally grown or you're growing them yourself, which impacts the food access, quality of food. How is it treated so that it gets to us and stays fresh, and what growing season did it even come from? So all of that includes place as well, I think.
I like what you said about Instagram being a digital quilt in a lot of ways. Yeah, that was really powerful. Yeah. And how does place play? I mean, I think about place like the Red Lines table runner. It was specific for a place and time. When I think about the lynching series, I'm thinking about specific times and places. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship in Indiana.
Well, I mean, I was born here. That sounded really bad. I'm sorry. But I'm definitely much more of a nomad. I was born here, but my family's migrated here from Appalachia, the Bayou, from everywhere. And then we migrated a lot and moved, and I've lived lots of places in my own adult life. So my idea around place is really wherever you are is your place, and you have an opportunity, whether you're there 2 weeks, 2 years, 2 minutes, to make a contribution and an impact, even if that means you're standing there and you see like cups rolling by. You have an option to make that place your place and make it beautiful and pick up that trash. And so with my own art practice, oftentimes it is my kind of job to go into places of conflict, and I am the neutral party. And people have to be willing and skilled enough to do that, because my alignment is not to you mad at Miss Such and Such. My alignment is to how do we create space for healing? That is why I'm there. And sometimes there has to be a person there who has an alignment that's not about all the mess that's going on. That's not necessarily even about the history we're addressing, because we're all impacted by it in different ways. And so I'm much more of a nomad. And it's funny, I was in this social justice program, but how many people from around the world I've been talking to that was in the program, and I'm like, oh my God, this is like my tribe from all over the world. These are some from Malaysia that you feel like you belong to me, that you're from Canada, but you belong to me. And we are sitting around co-conspirating on how we're going to get me to Malaysia or them to the US and how we're going to make something together. And so it's a different framework when you feel like every place is your place. If you show up, you can be responsible. And sometimes your presence is the thing that is needed for transformation. I think, especially I see this on my community development role, that there gets to be this question of the answers in the room. Well, not if it's the same 10 by 10 room with the same 10 people for the past 10 years. Maybe we need to add a little different flavor to that so that somebody can have a different question at this point. That has just not been how humanity has been. We bump up against each other. We're like, oh, what you doing? This is what I'm doing. What are you doing? Now, sometimes that does lead to wars. We will not lie about that. But sometimes it leads to all this great beauty. So why is there this notion that it's the same 10 people in the same room for the past 10 years and that's okay? Because sometimes someone needs to just ask a different question. And sometimes that's not you. And so every place is my place. That's how I approach it. And that's why when the quilts come to communities, I don't just show up with the quilts. I'm like, well, who's my boots on the ground person? And let's work this out between us. Now let's figure out how we're going to get the kids in there, because kids are always have to be a part of it. And what are we doing to support community to deal with the work? That's why the quilts don't go everywhere, because if you're not willing to do that aspect of it, then there's no reason for me to just be there with the quilts if you won't do the community part, because the community part is the artwork. That is the extension of the work of creating space for community, which is actually how we end up with the quilts in the first place. So again, that's probably not what you were looking for, but that's as real as it gets.
Oh, that was great. I just want to do a quick time check. How are we doing on time? 30? Okay. Should we go to Q&A now or? Okay. I had one more quick question about equity and social justice, because I mean, we're using the term creative practice, but it's kind of a synonym for activism. And I want you to talk about how you use art in making, whether it's textile work or growing things or interactions with your community. How are you using it as a form of activism? Both?
Yeah, so I actually don't look at it that way. I do view it as a creative practice. I don't even, this like whole term with like art, what's your artistic practice is even like problematic, because it really is like the underpinnings of how is creativity across every aspect of your life, and how do you use it? How do you use it to make sure the neighbors get food? How do you use it to make sure that the kids aren't walking to school being sexually harassed, which we have an entire art project that's dedicated just to that question, because it was offensive that the police said that they couldn't help the kids walking to school being sexually harassed. And so for me, it is a creative practice, because it's a way in which creativity is at the root of transformation. That this is where we start the problem solving, is to think differently how we get to a different solution. And I think that's important, because even these terms around how are you an artist in the Western context, that's especially this notion that artist is genius, artist gets to run around and be celebrated. And for me, the creative practice is in service of transformation. So it does mean you slow down to bring everybody with you. It does mean that time a quilt might be a little wobbly, and that's okay, because I know that woman drove 4 hours here to spend 20 minutes sewing because she needed to get off her chest what had happened to her uncle. And that's where the community lies. So I also don't necessarily know if that's activism. I'll let everybody else figure that out for themselves. For me, it gets rooted in how do we create spaces for healing? Because you can do a lot of activist work. You can be a click activist. How many of you people know go click, 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 like. Yes, that was wrong. Cancel that person. But that's very different than when you're like how you're going to get into the streets and create long haul work. We're talking about 2 decades on one project. If it was a human being, it would be on its way to college next year. And that's different than just, and my own mentor, and I have to, one of them always talks about, are you doing community healing work? Or are you talking about a subject? Because those are different, and it doesn't mean one's right or wrong, but you need to be very clear about what you're doing, because at the root of them is a different level of accountability. When you show up and say, how do we create this space that we can transform? How do we create this space that is going to be rough? But we can't do this if we're willing to. And there does have to be artwork to be like, look at that. See, that was wrong, and go on. But you entering the process have to know where you're situated, because if not, you can actually do a lot of harm. And I always think of the work of you're a textile person, Mel Chin, and how he talks about the work that he did right after Katrina, that literally within a day, he was able to garner up off his art folks, and were in their van and they ran down to New Orleans. And after a few months, the community was like, yes, but you get to leave. You're not staying here, you get to leave. And how that really derailed him. He was like, oh, I was just showing up to help. And so it does become this question of how do you walk into a space? How do you walk out of a space? And what do you leave behind when it's time for you to go? And so it's interesting when then you see what happens to the Flint water crisis, how he shows up again, but with a totally different practice, at the center being community. Because at that first time, that was about him showing up, artist as genius. Look at all we can do here. That other process where he left behind ways in which people sent millions of these, but how do we turn this into economic opportunity for that community? How do we they actually wove this into fabric, and then had this huge fabric show to talk about what had happened in Flint. And it becomes this whole industry that it becomes a different way when you center community. And so for me, at the center is community and healing. Some people call that activism. I don't know, I see a lot of clicked activists, and I don't see a lot going on. I see a lot of people shouting and screaming. And then when you ask them about, but what's that long haul work looks like? What is that 20-year dedication? What does it mean for you to even hang in there 5 years to get the project done? Then it started looking a little different. People start, well, I don't know. So I do use my creative practice for that. And it doesn't mean I don't have my little quirky projects that are just at home. Those are mine. I make these little lynching pods. It's like a stress reliever. They just pile up all over the place, but it's my thing. I'm not out there saying this is transformative. I'm like, that's my stress reliever. Leave the lynch pods alone. Those are my things over there. So that's kind of how I center it.
I have a similar feeling. I don't think of myself as an activist, and that's not the approach that I'm taking when I'm entering my artwork, my artwork is my life work. It's one and the same, and it doesn't stop. With my growing and gardening and plant knowledge, that's my healing modality, and it starts for me and ripples out from there. So I want to make sure that I have an understanding of that before I even try to help anybody else. So it's very important that I'm doing the work for myself and on myself before I try to impact another person, because I try to be very aware of the marks that I'm leaving on someone else. And so as my art practice has grown, I've needed to take on assistance for projects, and I started assisting LaShonda. I think you were the first person that I ever worked as an assistant for. And so having worked as an assistant and learning how important it is to have a relationship and community and communication as well. I think about when I'm working in my own practice, how am I impacting the person that I'm teaching, and how do I effectively communicate and make sure that they're learning what they need to learn? How is my art practice a healing modality for them so that they can enter the space and feel like they've left with something meaningful, something useful, and that I've left a positive mark on them. So passing on information is also a healing modality, I guess, in a way, through helping whoever shows up. Sometimes it's not who you think it will be. And so if we think of equity in that way, the people that show up in my art practice may look very different than me. Sometimes they might look the same, but sometimes they don't. And I want to remain open to who shows up and open to the impact that they make on somebody else's life because of the experience that they've had working with me.
That's great. I love that. I mean, today I didn't even know that you two had worked together, like beyond Red Lines, that you had been LaShonda's assistant. And I had the opportunity to meet your assistant, whose name I'm forgetting right now, but Ayana. So I could see a genealogy, knowledge being passed down. So that's really beautiful.
Take a snappy real quick.
I would love to get any questions, any comments from the audience.
Good evening, and thank you very much for being here. I am thoroughly enjoying this talk. So the question that I have, and I'm very curious about it, is you talked about a video that you have of the folding of the quilt that you did at 100 Acres. Is it possible for us to see it, or is it online, and how do we access it? Okay.
Project it got to the point where they literally, the horticultural team was like, this is like chaos. They literally put us on the back of this little truck so they could just drive the truck back and we could like just keep folding it. Because at one time, keep in mind, that was us bent over, fold this piece, in the box, fold this piece, box. And so it's comedy something. It was like, what are you doing? It was like, we got to find a better way. So he went and got the little truck and just slowly but surely backed up the truck. And we didn't like him. God, I need a truck. I need a truck for the rest of my life with this quilt.
First of all, thank you so much. That was fantastic. So really appreciate you being here and taking time to speak with us. I have a truck, so when you need a truck, call me. We will do that together. It was interesting to me. I was thinking about something my father used to talk about when we had a farm and how that work on the farm connected to the past and the future, not just the present. And I thought that was really true when you were talking about textiles as well and about quilting. And his concern was that without that connection to the past and future, people only living in the present, they don't see a bigger picture. And so that was something that sort of was coming to mind for me. But most importantly, I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing, not just in the show, but in the community. And I think it's incredibly important work, and we have work left to do, but I'm still feeling very optimistic. I'm nervous. We have an election coming up very shortly, but I'm really grateful for the optimism and the commitment that you bring to everything you do. So thank you so much. Sorry, that's not a question.
Thank you. I also want to thank the two artists. Your stories are really inspiring, and you both speak about your work very eloquently. So thank you for being here and sharing your insights. My question, though, is actually for Jonathan. I think when Joseph introduced you, he said something about you were dedicated to having Indiana artists in the exhibition. And there's so many people to choose from. You know, we do have a very vibrant arts community here. And I'm just wondering, what about these two women in particular, or the other Indiana artists you picked, like Sam Jones, just really resonated with you in terms of the your curatorial concept for the exhibition? I mean, I can see the textile with LaShonda, given your background in textiles and fashion and your interest in that. But what particularly about them was, out of all the people that you picked them?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. You're absolutely right. There's a plethora of artistic talent in Indianapolis and Indiana. It was really hard. I mean, it came down to the artists whose work really fit within the curatorial concept that we were working with, who had work that was available to show. But there's artists who I won't name that we wanted to include in the show, but there wasn't the space, or they didn't have work that was available to include in the show. So you're absolutely right. Like Indiana and Indianapolis in particular has a vibrant, thriving arts community for a number of reasons. Those the artists that are in the show. All the above. I mean, this exhibition is the product of several conversations. I talked to LaShonda. One of the first people I talked to was Shamira. Been talking to Shamira for over a year, in person and over Zoom. So it was conversations. I mean, one of the first things I did is had conversations with people. Conversations with Joseph, conversations with Marla, who was the gallery assistant at the time. Just through conversations and meeting with artists and curators. I also have to shout out Butter. We went to Butter and learned about artists through Butter. So
Shamira, we saw the image of the mural that you painted. Could you talk a little bit about sort of where that imagery comes from, and how does that relate to the theme of the show in your own practice?
Sure, that imagery comes from the vanilla plant. So for this exhibition, I chose to do the complicated story of vanilla. And it was inspired by Edmund Albius, who is the young enslaved boy from Madagascar who invented the technique to pollinate vanilla. He was about 12 years old, I want to say. So a lot of people didn't know about that story. So I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to bring forward a story that was not very well known. And particularly for this show, vanilla is something that we use every day. I don't know of a day that I don't come into contact with vanilla in some way. Yes. So specifically the way the aesthetics of that piece, it came together very organically. As Joseph mentioned and Jonathan mentioned, my work is typically very linear and very textile inspired. So this just serendipitously happened in that the logistics of this exhibition, I was able to be on site for about 2 weeks. And I was in the galleries painting, and I created it on the spot. And whenever that happens, it's usually very organic because the textile work takes a lot of planning and the geometry takes a lot of time to put together. So whenever I can loosen up and be a bit freer, I do welcome that opportunity. And so this was my rendition of a vanilla plant, and Jonathan really encouraged me to just go wild with it. And I like to call it freestyling because I put the colors together in a way that makes sense to me on the spot and can bring forward certain elements and highlight the story of the piece. And I also liked adding a lot of very bold colors and really just claiming that space in the corner and shouting out vanilla.
It's interesting when you're creating, when you're doing the mural, because I was here while you were like doing it. You listen to music and you listen to lectures, and I found it really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about some of the readings, some of the videos that you're watching, some of the materials that you're consuming as you're creating, and how it might inspire your work?
If you know me personally, you know that my spiritual life is very important to me. So that's my everyday practice. I start my day with meditation. I take my time to ease into my art practice. So I put that first and foremost in my life and in my day. And so when I have the opportunity, when I'm on a site, I'm typically probably listening to something that's informing my spiritual life, making sure that I'm grounded and centered and carrying that forward to the way that I'm interacting with anything around me. So when I was here, sometimes I start my practice with music, like if I'm starting a new project. I grew up Primitive Baptist, and I have a much broader understanding of religion at this point in my life, but we grew up singing hymns and like Dr. Watts. If you have an opportunity, please listen to Dr. Watts hymns. They're very different than what you might encounter traditionally in a church and very old school. So sometimes I might listen to Dr. Watts and just have a church moment in my home studio and just enjoy that ritual of starting out with movement and dance and sound and song. And that loosens me up. It brings everybody with me and creates very different space than if I started off differently. So I might be listening to something like that. I watched a lot of Gaia, got a Gaia subscription and watched YouTube, anything. Sacred Geometry was playing very heavily when I was in the studio this time. So understanding the visual elements of what I'm putting into the work, the frequency, the vibration. I really am geeking out about vibrational medicine right now and the subtleties of shapes and how they impact us and the colors and all of those things.
Good questions. Thank you.